Hello and welcome to this next episode of our Expert Talk Sales. Today we're going to have a deep dive discussion on the topic of qualification and its merits. My guest today has a lifetime of experiences in the area of sales and specializes also in today's topic, qualification. So welcome Bob Apollo, founder and COO, Chief Outcomes Officer of Inflection Point Strategy Partner. Hi Bob, thank you for your time.
Hi, Annette. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, thank you, me too. So to everyone listening on LinkedIn, if you have a question to Bob or to our conversation, please just post a comment and next to that video, and we will try to address that during our conversation. So Bob, as a first start, can you introduce yourself? How did you land in the field of enabling sales leaders and sales organizations?
Yeah, well, I started, as many of my colleagues in this line of business did, as an employee of a technology business. Over the years, my career spanned corporates, scale-ups, and startups. I actually learned that the environment that I preferred was this all-important scale-up phase, you know, when an organization's proved that it's got something that it can take to market, but now it really needs to exploit those opportunities. So inevitably, I lived through a number of acquisitions, mergers, and so on. And after I dropped off the corporate hamster wheel, I've now been working with scale-up technology-based businesses, helping them to build a really scalable and predictable business model. And qualification, opportunity qualification, is a really key part of that.
So can you shortly clarify the terminology qualification? What it is exactly?
So I'll use it in the context of a sales opportunity. I mean, there are other applications of the word qualification in selling, but probably the most important is qualifying a sales opportunity. And to me, what it means is assessing not just whether or not the customer is likely to buy from us, because if they're not, there's not really much value in pursuing, but also, and I think sometimes this is missed, assessing whether they're likely to do anything. So when I think of qualification, is this the right sort of customer? Is it the right sort of need that we can satisfy? Could we do it profitably? Are they likely to do anything? And are they likely to do, make that decision in our favor?
So there's a whole bunch of tasks that you would have to do during the qualification. So is there a specific timeline where it is, or how does that go?
Well, now I'm going to talk from my experience of relatively complex business environments, and life might be a bit simpler if you have a very straightforward transactional sale. But let's look at the more complicated scenario, because we can always simplify from there. So for me, qualification is a continuous process. It's not something you just do once, particularly if you're, let's say, investing months of time in developing the opportunity. There are certain things you're unlikely to uncover or prove at an early stage in the conversation. So as your dialogue with the customer continues, you're progressively qualifying the opportunity, and preferably doing it against very clearly defined criteria so that every salesperson within your organization is looking at opportunities in the same way.
So if I understand that correctly, there's basically no end to qualification until you're in the deal, right?
And by the way, you could be at a very advanced stage and something changes in the customer's environment, which means that both the probability of them doing anything and maybe the probability of you winning comes crashing down. So you always need to be aware of these things.
Yes, cool. You also mentioned just the very specific standardized objects you have to qualify against, right? And you expanded the famous MADIC framework to with some more details that you call now MedPicker, right?
Right.
Can you shortly elaborate on why do you need those criteria?
Sure.
And why was this this expansion necessary?
Absolutely. Well, let me just very briefly anchor this by saying that historically, many salespeople were educated to qualify against BANT, budget, authority, need, and time frame. And that really, if you unpick it, assumed that the customer had a funded project, that all they had to do was to choose who to implement the project with. And I think that's a fundamentally unsuitable mindset if you're, for example, in a SaaS business or any business where it's not inevitable the customer's going to buy. So I can't claim credit for it, but probably over a period of about 20 years, an approach to qualification called MEDIC, initially in the technology sector. I think subsequently it's been embraced much more widely, evolved. And the first handful of criteria, so MEDIC is an acronym, and what it stands for are firstly metrics. Do we understand the metrics that the customer is going to use when they're considering the pain that they're suffering today and the gain that they might accomplish in the future? And the key thing with metrics is there's got to be the strongest possible contrast between the measures that reflect where they are today and where they believe or aspire to get to. So that was the first. The second one is economic buyer. And the reason that's important is sometimes salespeople find themselves talking to an enthusiastic member of a potential customer, but that person really doesn't have the power to make the decision. And that person or that group, because sometimes it's a group, is the economic buyer or economic buyers. And they make fundamentally a business or financial judgment about whether to go ahead and who to go ahead with. So that's the E. The next one is decision criteria. So if you don't know how the customer's going to decide, you are really going blind. And the best salespeople actually seek to influence the customer's decision criteria. The second D in MEDIC is decision process. What steps are the customer going to go through in deciding first whether to do anything and whether to, do it with you? The I stands for intensity of pain. So it's really a P, but it's labeled an I. And what that basically says is if there isn't a strong enough reason to change, they probably won't. They'll stick with the status quo. And then the last conventional C, 6 C's that make up basic MEDIC, is champion. Have we got a champion inside the account who's promoting us? And again, what I'd say is that sometimes results in a rather narrow-minded view. You focus on whether we've got somebody who's enthusiastic about our company and our product, but we also need to be thinking about, is this person capable of championing the project? At a time when their organization's probably considering a bunch of other things they could spend money on, have I found somebody who's championing the project, not just championing my company and my offering? And I have to tell you that those 6 criteria just by themselves are if applied consistently, are a huge improvement on the way in which historically salespeople might have qualified, or maybe they didn't even think or weren't required to qualify. So it's already a very good foundation. But in the businesses that I work with, there are some other considerations. One of them is, so if it's a complex deal, a high value deal, we also need to understand the customer's approval process. So that's where the P in MedPick comes in. Do we understand? I mean, it's P for either paper or process, but it's really about, so even if we win the decision in principle, what happens then? And again, if we don't know that, we can really be led astray. And then the second C in MedPick is competition. Who are we competing against, and what is our relative strength and weakness? And that's about as far as, you know, conventional application of medical MedPick has gone. And you know, for some, that's enough. For some, it's overkill. And what I'd encourage the audience to do is to choose those qualification criteria that, you know, actual real life experience demonstrates are very important in determining whether the customer is going to do anything and whether you have a chance of winning. Now, in the world in which I typically work of technology, discretionary purchase, there are two more things that you might want to pay attention to, and that's how MedPick evolved to MedPicker. And that's where I'm going to stop, actually, but let's just explore what those last two R's are. The first one is relative priority. And perhaps some of you listening will have experienced a situation where you won the decision in principle, and the customers, and you've negotiated maybe mutually acceptable terms. And the customers said to you, if we go ahead, we are definitely going to go ahead with you. But then the project stalls. And the reason why that stalls very often is this project had a lower relative priority than the other things that the customer was considering investing in. And it's so important to have an awareness of that. You mustn't, in my view, narrow your focus just to who else are we competing against in this project? Because at the end of the day, at the end of the cycle, your strongest competitor is either do nothing or another project. And the last R, and it's really a reminder, is what could go wrong, risk factors. And you probably had past experience of things that could go wrong in similar deals. So are we aware of them, and are we mitigating those risk factors? So that's how MedPicker evolved.
So thank you for that explanation of all those different, of the whole acronym. If I understand it correctly, basically it's trying to give the salesperson a help to have a really customer-centric thinking, right? Because it's like really all those points is understand your buyer from the get-go.
That is so important. So if you go back to BANT, one of the letters in the acronym was need. And of course, a customer needs to have some sort of requirement in order for them to think about purchasing. But the truth in a complex buying process is that there are many more dynamics at play. And MedPicker encourages the salesperson to really put themselves in the customer's shoes, to understand the dynamics of the customer, of their buying process, of the decision group, and so on, and armed with that knowledge to do a better job both of qualifying and actually of conducting a successful sales campaign. Yeah, customer centricity is absolutely critical. And very, very quickly, not today's subject, but I would always strongly recommend to sales organizations that are in this sort of complex environment, think about your sales stages reflecting where the buyer is in their journey, rather than the classic stages of discovery, demonstration, proposal, and so on. Because if you're customer-centric in how you chart the customer's progress, you'll also behave, I think, more intelligently, and you'll win more often. Or you'll qualify out more quickly.
To pick up on that, I think we have an interesting question. And the question is whether there are specific milestones in the qualifying deal, or where you would say it's go and continue versus no go and drop the decision points. Can you shortly elaborate?
By the way, I don't think there's a single point, but let's say you are employing business development reps to try and find opportunities in the first place. They wouldn't be able to qualify the whole of Medic, but they'd probably make an assessment of, is this contact a potential champion or an economic buyer? How intense is the customer's pain? And so on. And that might be the first checkpoint, a partial evaluation. Then you go through discovery and you learn more and you complete other aspects of MedPicker. And at that point, I think there's another checkpoint. So there's probably at least 2 formal checkpoints in that. Is there the essence of a deal? So it's worth investing my sales time in. And having invested my sales time, am I now confident that, what are the odds of the customer doing anything and of me winning?
Okay.
And so what I normally do with clients is we allocate certain parts of the MedPick acronym and say, by the end of the first stage, you at least need to understand this. And that's part of your go, no go. By the end of the second phase, you need to understand the following characteristics. So I talked about paper process or approval process. That sometimes you don't get to learn until later on in the deal, but you need to watch out for it. And relative priority, you might only really get a sense of that once you've really scoped up the opportunity. So I'm a great believer in milestones and in associating qualification and requalification with different steps in the pipeline.
Yeah, cool. And we have another question. I think that also nicely links to that, because how you explain it is, it makes all sense, but it also sounds really complicated, right? So there are those now 10 points that you have to be aware of. I mean, with milestone, it makes it a little bit easier. And also the question is, how important are tools? Can they help us going forward?
Critically important. Because what you really want is for your salespeople to be guided in this process. And I have to say to you that unfortunately, many traditional CRM implementations feel like an admin system to salespeople rather than a guide. And that's where, some of the modern approaches to CRM like Membrane, which was designed from the start to act as a guide rather than just an information repository, are so important. And I do think if you implement these potential capabilities in your CRM, you'll make it much easier for salespeople to embrace this. You can, include little guides reminding them about key things to look for. You can color code the qualification in a way that makes it very visual. These are all ways of making it digestible. And one last point, I would never suggest that every environment always needs all of those 10 factors. It might be over-engineering it. But one of the ways of judging is look at where you won and lost, and particularly where you lost, and at the sort of conversations that might have gone along the lines of, if only I'd known that earlier, if only I'd done that earlier, I might either have a more successful sales campaign, or I might have wised up and worked out this really isn't a winnable deal. So I'm going to very politely disqualify the customer rather than continuing to throw my own time and my colleagues' time at it.
Okay, that gives a nice understanding to say, like, okay, those are the points of those 10 that I really have to look at.
Yeah.
Also, what came up now is, how do you reinforce the behavior to follow in the clear qualification process? So how can I, as a salesperson, better learn it?
Well, there are very good guides. I like to think that I've got a good guide, but actually their best guide might and should be their sales manager. So I think sales managers have got a critical role in helping salespeople become better qualifiers. And in fact, I think the role of the sales manager is almost to be the devil's advocate, to push back and really test whether the salesperson has done more than a checkbox exercise when they're qualifying. They've really thought about it. They can share evidence that supports their view that the opportunity is well qualified in this aspect or not. Almost the worst thing you could do is to just think of qualifying as a tick box exercise. You know, I need to tick this box before my CRM will allow me to go forwards. And that's I think that's a really inappropriate thing. So your manager's guidance and your manager's role, and accept it in the way that it's intended, to almost stress test your qualification and see whether you really thought it through. You'll appreciate it at the end of the day, even if it's an uncomfortable conversation at the time.
So has the sales manager position changed in the last years?
Not the best ones, no. There has always been a huge gap between good and bad sales managers. You know, I'd say an ineffective and old school sales manager, when they're reviewing opportunities, it's just like, you know, firing off, what's the value, what's the close date, what's the stage, what's the probability, what's the next step. And it's just an exchange of facts that sometimes aren't facts. Whereas the better sales managers use those things as opportunities for coaching. They have always, the better sales managers, got scratched below the surface and sought to understand and help. And I do think that perhaps one of the things that's changed is, if you're a sales manager and you're not investing, I don't know, 20, 30% of your time in really effective sales coaching, you will not get the best out of your salespeople. I don't think it's ever been more important.
Okay, so the coaching role is definitely very important to be able to have a proper approach to the whole qualification process for the salespeople.
And here's the challenge. Many sales managers were promoted because they were good salespeople. They weren't trained in the art of sales management. They might not be, you know, have the natural gifts to coach, although those gifts can certainly be developed. Yeah.
Okay. I also have another question coming up, and that is, what do you think about using algorithm and historic data, deal data and analysis to support the qualification of opportunities?
I think the better intelligence you have, the smarter decisions you'll make. I don't think you can rely completely on artificial intelligence and machine learning and algorithms, but what those things can do is to recognize patterns and to challenge you where you're working in an opportunity where the pattern that you're seeing doesn't align with successful patterns that, you know, we've seen in past deals. So I think it's not an alternative to informed judgment, but it can be a very powerful complement to judgment. And one of the reasons I say this is, you know, business to business deals, particularly large ones involving multiple stakeholders, involving perhaps multiple colleagues on your side, there is no single process, perfect process formula. But what you can do is to work out whether things are heading in the right direction or not. So it's a powerful complement. It's not a substitute.
Great. Thank you. So if you talk about all those different aspects of a very detailed qualification process, and also this important position of the sales manager, I start to thinking, is there a kind of culture that fits best for such a clear framework? Does the company have some culture to have so that you, in order to live that properly?
Well, you know, and honestly, in some startups, it does appear that they've kind of got to make it up as you go along, heroic effort. close the next deal. But at the end of the day, that culture, exciting though it might be to live in, all right, you talked about when we were talking offline, living in interesting times, where you can very often live in interesting times in a startup. But I do think at some point the organization needs to mature, because if it's going to scale, it needs to have not a rigid process that constrains them so tightly that the salespeople can't show their initiative and their creativity, but something that guides them in best practice. Yeah, sets them off on the right track. So I do think you need a culture that recognizes, you need a management that recognizes that best practices, common language, common standards, when adopted without suppressing creativity and initiative, are going to be the best way of achieving what are often very ambitious growth targets. And also think about, they'll probably in that point be recruiting many new salespeople. So how do you induct those new salespeople into your way of selling? If you haven't established it, they're going to be thrashing around and almost certainly won't succeed.
And if we're now living a lot of in the remote areas, how do you see that changing of people onboarding and learning the qualification process without being easily to go along with some colleagues and witnesses?
Well, so it is a little harder, isn't it? But there are various tools and devices. I mean, I run interactive workshops with my clients where there's a lot of lateral learning going on, so the colleagues can learn from each other. Sometimes having an external perspective can be really helpful with that. Listening to call recordings is actually a self-coaching tool, which can help you recognize for yourself, you know, where it went well, where it could be improved, and then that's something your manager can coach you in. I would say there's one fundamental principle though. If you're not prepared to be honest with yourself as a salesperson, you'll really struggle in this environment and in the future environment. You know, you've got to acknowledge reality.
That's an important part, definitely. And if there's one thing you could recommend a salesperson to that are listening now immediately to change in the sales cycle, does one thing come to mind?
I think it is. I mean, I've got my preference for MedPicker. It isn't right for everyone, but it would be achieve a consensus within the sales organization about the common standards and process you're going to use to qualify opportunities. So everybody's looking at opportunities in the same way.
Yes, coming up with one coherent set of criteria. Yep. Thank you. So, but to be aware of time, because time is running tightly, is there anything on the topic of qualification that we have not covered yet that you think we should shortly address?
I don't think so. I mean, I'd reinforce the real importance of self-honesty in this, and an honest dialogue with yourself and with your manager, and be willing to disqualify if it doesn't look right. The best salespeople have the confidence to disqualify an opportunity early if it doesn't look right. Whereas the less confident, less experienced salespeople typically, unfortunately, cling on to opportunities that any rational analysis would say are not winnable, and their performance suffers as a result. So it's not just qualify, it's be prepared to disqualify.
Thank you. So what I take from the 3 points is the common process, being willing to disqualify, yep, and the honesty towards myself and really looking in the eye of what is here.
Yep. Don't fool yourself.
And thank you, Bob, for your time. Thank you so much for this talk. Really enjoyed it. I guess we've covered tons of important and interesting information. So thank you.
I appreciate the invite. I've enjoyed the conversation, and I hope our listeners find the the information we've shared useful in their own sales lives.
Yes, I hope that too. So thank you everyone for listening, and yeah, thank you, Bob, for your time.
All right, thank you.